Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. I want to start off talking about what happened in the White House yesterday, the Abraham Accords. Now, here's one of my frustrations with the lamestream media, is everyone in the media assumes that we all know exactly what everyone's talking about here, right? So they'll be like, oh, Israel and Bahrain signed a peace agreement. And they just move on as if, yeah, like anyone can point to where Bahrain is on a map, let alone like who the leader is and what their motivations are, whatever. And I'm certain that even the people in the media don't really know either, which is why they probably skip over it. Anyway, I say that because I want to get down to basics here and from an expert, Nigel Gardiner from Heritage Foundation and a former aide to the great Margaret Thatcher. Mr. Gardiner, how are you, sir?
Fine, thank you very much. Great to be here. How are you?
Very good. First of all, does that make sense, like that most people don't really know what this is, and probably most people in the media don't even really understand the full ramifications or importance of this either? Yeah,
I don't think the media really has given enough credit to the significance, the huge significance of what we saw yesterday. In fact, I was at the White House attending the signing ceremony of the Abraham Accords, and it was a magnificent event. It was one of the most moving and powerful events that I've been to in Washington for many, many years. And you had the leaders there of the United States, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain all sitting down together, signing an historic agreement that is going to significantly advance peace in the Middle East. And the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are two very significant U.S. allies in the Arab world, the Gulf states. They are key partners for the U.S. They have signed an agreement to normalize relations with Israel, which is a very, very big deal for Arab countries to do. So the last time we saw an agreement like this was actually with Jordan back in 1994. So this is immensely significant, and it greatly strengthens, I think, U.S. leadership in the Middle East. It strengthens the anti-Iran coalition that President Trump has been building. I think it enhances Israeli security, and this is a very good deal for all sides here. And I think tremendous credit is due actually to President Trump and the Trump administration for driving this process through against all odds, frankly. And this is a deal that Barack Obama could never have achieved actually as president.
Well, had 8 years, didn't do it. Can we break down some of the players? Let's start with the UAE, United Arab Emirates. What do we need to know about them and their motivations and values and et cetera?
Well, the United Arab Emirates, of course, is a key Gulf player, basically. They're very close to Saudi Arabia, of course, which is the regional power in that part of the world. And this also raises hopes that the Saudis as well may sign a deal with Israel. So the fact that the UAE is moving forward here is very, very significant. And the United Arab Emirates is a key part of the US-led anti-Iran coalition. And so, I think that on so many levels, this is a very, very important move here. And the UAE is a country that, in my view, is very strategically significant for the United States in that region.
Why would the UAE not have had normalized relations with Israel up until now?
Well, it's really all about the Palestinian issue, and that's the key issue for many of the Gulf states here. So the UAE has, resisted previous attempts actually to sign this kind of agreement because of the Palestinian issue. And certainly we saw, some movement by Israel on this issue in terms of annexation of settlements in the West Bank. And the Israelis certainly, under Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, certainly have done all they can to make an agreement that does not compromise the safety and security of Israel. And I think that this is an agreement where, I think all sides have actually come to the negotiating table. They've made some concessions on all sides here, but certainly the sticking point was the Palestinian issue. It is of course important to note that the Palestinian leadership is opposed to the deal, because the Palestinian leadership, of course, is close to Hamas and an array of terrorist organizations. So the Palestinians are not cooperating with this deal. But what is most important here is you've got, some of the biggest players actually among the Gulf states who have signed up to this agreement. They're now putting tremendous pressure on the Palestinians to fundamentally reform their ways and their behavior. So this is a real game changer for the region.
Okay, so you said the UAE is a pretty influential force over there. What about Bahrain? Are there any differences between Bahrain and UAE, or is it the same sort of deal?
Well, Bahrain is also an important player in the region. Bahrain also holds a very large U.S. naval base as well. And so Bahrain is a long-term U.S. military partner. And so the U.S. has, long held, a strategically close relationship with Bahrain. And the fact that you have Bahrain and the UAE combined joining this agreement means that this significantly enhances the possibility of Saudi Arabia actually signing a deal as well with Israel. And the Saudis, of course, are the regional sort of superpower there. And I think that the fact that you've got two countries here, not just one, signing onto this historic Abraham Accord agreement, I mean, this is a big achievement. And we've not seen a deal like this actually in the past. So you've had two countries actually normalizing relations with Israel. And so we cannot underestimate the significance of this.
Well, that's amazing. So what does the deal say exactly? What does normalizing relations mean? I've heard that.
Yeah.
And the second part of that is, what did Trump / America / Israel have to give up, right? Because I feel like it's the give and take, right? We were told with the Iran deal, we had to give up all these things, including cash, to the Iranians. Did we have to do any of that for this type of deal?
Yeah. Well, firstly, with regard to what this deal actually does, so the normalization of relations means the full restoration of diplomatic relations, or the full implementation of diplomatic relations between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. It also means basically the implementation of full economic ties as well. And this is very important for the region. I mean, this is a deal that advances prosperity, trade, investment, economic freedom in the region. And so, this is a good deal for the Middle East. It's a job creator, actually. It's also good in terms of foreign direct investment coming into the region. And so when you combine, the implementation of diplomatic political ties together with, with trade and investment, this is a win-win situation for the whole region here.
That's really interesting, the trade part. If I can jump in real quick, the trade's really interesting. I haven't thought about that or heard anything about that. What would be an example of something that wasn't traded that now could be traded?
Yeah. So for example, Israel is actually an international leader in in high tech pharmaceuticals. So the Israelis are working on on a vaccine for COVID-19, as is the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries. And I think that the cooperation between Israel and the Gulf partners on medical technology, for example, is very good for the region, and that's an example of how this kind of cooperation will save lives in the long run.
Wow. And do you believe? Are you of the thought that companies that trade and cooperate together, I guess, except for American China, perhaps, but generally are peaceful?
Yes, yeah, exactly. The more investment and trade you have between countries, the less likely you're going to have conflict. And so the economic dimension is a big part of all this as well, and it's great actually for creating jobs actually, and for enhancing the prosperity of the region. And this was a big part of the US-led initiative. And you asked a question about whether the United States made any concessions here, and in my view, the United States did not have to make concessions here. I mean, this was a win-win for America as well. It is fundamentally different to the awful, disastrous Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which greatly strengthened Iran at the expense of the United States and Israel and its allies. And the Iran deal is very strongly opposed by the UAE and Bahrain and all of the Gulf states here. And so this is a deal that's totally different, actually, to the Iran nuclear deal. And it did not require the United States sacrificing its interests. In fact, this is a deal that really advances America's strategic goals in the region.
Very good. What do you think President Trump or his people, maybe specifically Jared Kushner, brought to the table that they could make it happen when decades and decades of other administration leaders couldn't. Now, you could just say it's just good timing. Or was it more than that? What specifically do you think they brought to the table?
It's a great question. It's much more than, good timing. I think that, this deal was a result of several years of behind-the-scenes efforts by the president directly, also by Jared Kushner and his team. You also had Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, also involved deeply in the process here. And I think what it boiled down to was the fact that President Trump developed close personal relationships with Israel, with the UAE, and with Bahrain, and with all of the key Gulf allies. President Obama didn't have those personal relationships. In fact, Obama demonstrated, I think, a real disdain for Israel. Our Gulf allies really hated the Iran nuclear deal, so they didn't want to do any business with Obama. And so, Obama really, I think, damaged America's image among our allies in the Middle East, whereas President Trump has greatly enhanced the U.S. image and U.S. influence and strategic power in the region. And the president has built up this very powerful anti-Iran coalition together with Israel. And all of the Gulf Arab states have signed up actually to this US-led coalition. So this is a big achievement on so many levels for the United States. It's something that previous presidents were not able to actually achieve. And I think that this is an example where President Trump has defied all expectations. He's really led in the region. And he's made a lot of friends, and that's good for America.
Wow, so when you say personal relations, that's super interesting. So you really think I don't want to say it's that simple, because it's not. I mean, there's cultural and historical hurdles to overcome here. But you think it was really just like the businessman-y side of Trump bringing people together, like yucking it up at the conference table and, hey, we're friends, let's come together, let's make a deal? Like, it's that?
Well, I mean, that's part of the big picture, and that's President Trump's style. I mean, he wants people to sit down together and work out a deal. But I think there's a lot more to it. I think that the leaders of Israel, UAE, and Bahrain really trusted President Trump. And if you look at Benjamin Netanyahu, the terrific Prime Minister of Israel, he didn't trust Barack Obama at all, but he really trusts President Trump, which is why the Israelis are willing to do a deal that could have been very risky actually for Israel. But the Israelis moved forward. They had full confidence and faith in the Trump administration. And I think it's confidence building, it's trust building that is the most important component here. And plus as well, and I think the president has a lot of energy. He's a high energy negotiator, and he likes to bring people together to strike a deal. And he succeeded in doing so today. And I think the president really deserves a lot of credit for strengthening American leadership in the world.
It's really amazing. Just to wrap up here now, I have an article here from 2017 where John Kerry, then Secretary of State, said he was Secretary of State. He said Trump moving embassy to Jerusalem would lead to Mideast explosion. And that has not aged well. And then this is the caption on CNN during the event that you were at yesterday, the signing of it. Trump holds White House event with large crowd, little social distancing. That was their take on it all, as opposed to everything you just outlined here.
The typical sort of negative approach. I mean, this was history in the making yesterday. I was there to witness it. This is a big day for American leadership on the world stage. And as for the, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, well, that's had a positive effect. It's not been a negative. And what did John Kerry actually achieve on the world stage? Absolutely nothing at all. And you contrast that with Mike Pompeo and President Trump today, and there's a vast gulf in achievement.
Very good. Very good. Nigel Gardiner, thank you for breaking it down, Nigel. Really appreciate you. Heritage Foundation, former aide to the great Margaret Thatcher. Yeah, let's do it again. Thank you, sir.
I look forward to it. Thanks very much.
Superb. Big deal. Big deal. Not going to let the media pass over this. We're going to talk much more about it. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So I read this the other day, and I think this is a helpful way to visualize and compartmentalize what's going on in our country today. So G. Thomas Burgess, who's a professor of African history at the Naval Academy, He said there's two groups when it comes to race. You have structuralists and culturalists. Structuralists and culturalists. Structuralists believe that racism and white supremacy are to blame for, well, specifically in this conversation, inner city conditions. And culturalists, and I'm quoting Mr. Burgess here, culturalists argue that blacks' own culture can and sometimes does play an important role in shaping social outcomes, right? So you have structuralists. This would be like Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter are structuralist, systemic racism, right? From our founding, at our core, and everything existing around us, capitalism itself even. Those are structuralists. They'll tell you, structuralists, Black Lives Matter, they'll tell you that culture has nothing to do with anything. And you're blaming the victim if you say culture does have an impact. I am a culturalist. Race is, the technical word is immutable. It cannot be changed. Race cannot be changed. You can't change the color of your skin. Culture can absolutely be changed. And change all the time. Cultures change, but on an individual level, habits change. And that's just the culture of your life, right? Right? So habit is the individual level. Your habits change, your life changes. And if a group of people, which we would call a culture, change, then the group of people's circumstances then change. Make sense? So cultures can change. Race can't change, culture can change. And I think it's really important to say this out loud because you're not supposed to anymore. Orlando Patterson, he's a sociologist at Harvard. He's from Jamaica, American now. He wrote a book in 2016 called The Cultural Matrix, Understanding Black Youth. Right? So let me quote Mr. Patterson here. He said, Black youth, and people generally, are not offended by attempts to change their values, habits, and even their modes of self-presentation if they are first persuaded that it's in their own best interest to do so. Jackie Rivers and I learned this firsthand from our study of a group of inner city youth, many with prison records, undergoing a demanding job training program that aimed to alter those aspects of their cultural styles and attitudes towards work that made it hard for them to get or keep a job. None of them considered this a threat to their identities as individuals or as Black people, right? So these guys had a culture, they had individual habits, and they had a larger culture that made them not be able to get or keep a job. And I'll get to that specifically in a second here. And this job training program sought to break that, or change the habits and change the culture. And no one was resentful. No one was like, oh, I'm Black. No one was offended at that effort, nor should anyone be. But Black Lives Matter tells you should. They go a step further. Black Lives Matter tells our kids, everybody, but our kids from a very young age, that everything is structural. So nothing you can do can overcome anything. Nothing you can do can overcome the oppression from the oppressors. Nothing you do can overcome the oppression, and you can't break the system. The system is bigger than you, it's more powerful than you. Nothing you can do can change that. So instead, with Black Lives Matter, their solution is to destroy the system, but also this force to equity. So in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, the second most popular book in this whole thing behind white fragility, but How to Be an Anti-Racist, the author of that, Kendi, he says that not only, obviously, seminars, these diversity, inclusion, equity seminars, but there needs to be a constitutional amendment that makes a federal Department of Equity that would make sure that every local law will result in equitable outcomes between the races in every single way, right? Which is an absurd concept, it's like ridiculous, but he wants to make a constitutional amendment and a federal bureaucracy to do that. So equity would all be mandated from the top. That's a structuralist, right? They believe the structure is racist, so they want to tear down the structure and create a new structure because they're structuralist by their nature. I would argue, and I think you would too, but I don't know, I would argue that it all instead needs to come from the bottom. Not from the top, it doesn't need to come from the federal government, it needs to come from the bottom. It needs to come from the family, habits. There's a culture of the family too. So it needs to come from the culture of your family and your individual habits. They need to change. And that's not offensive It's not offensive. Professor Burgess, he wrote this. He said, when asked in 2006 to evaluate the problems facing black men, so this is 2006, 14 years ago. When I think 2006, I still think that's like 2 years ago. 14 years ago, 92% of black youth, so 18 to 24, 92% said it's a big problem that young black men are not taking their education seriously enough. 92% of young black men said it's a big problem that young black men are not taking their education seriously enough. 88% said it's a big problem that young black men are not being responsible fathers. It's culture. It's habit and culture. Surely, if you did that survey today, only 14 years later, it would be the exact opposite, right? You'd have 92 and 88% of young people in particular saying that it's not culture, it's all racism, right? It's structures, racist structures. It's the systemic racism, and it's even traces back to our founding, our slaveocracy that we have in America, that black people aren't responsible fathers and don't value education. It's because of structural racism. Professor Burgess then says, this is Patterson. Patterson calls for black people to launch a, quote, social movement akin to the civil rights revolution, though one now directed at internal social and cultural transformation. So it's a civil rights movement, not externally focused, like Kendi calls for, right? A new federal bureaucracy, but internally focused, one focused on a social and cultural transformation. And surely Black Lives Matter would call him an Uncle Tom and all the other things. So here's my takeaway. You can change culture. We should change culture, right? Like we should always reflect on that. And that's what New Year's resolutions are, right? Just a reflection on your habits, your individual habits, and how you can do better to achieve a goal. There's nothing tricky about this. So you can change your culture and habits. You should change your culture and habits. You should always be reflecting on that. And people want to change their culture and habits for the better. It's not an offensive concept, even though we're told you're not supposed to say such a thing, because you're just blaming the victim. Let me give you an example. Black Lives Matter and other race groups like this, they say that it is a white supremacist value to show up on time, okay? Punctuality, showing up on time, is a white supremacist value. Do you remember that Smithsonian chart? You can throw it up, guys. Remember the Smithsonian chart from a couple weeks ago? And these guys aren't the only one. One of the sections was on time, and white. These are white supremacist value to follow rigid time schedules. Okay. Another way you may hear it written is they call them white professionalism standards. White professionalism standards, and part of that is showing up on time. Now, so it's a white thing. Okay? Being punctual is, well, I would argue being punctual is a habit. It's a habit on an individual level, and it's perhaps a culture on a larger level. Perhaps in the past, white bosses and managers have said black people don't show up on time. So instead of changing that habit and culture, which is easy to do, you're not born being late to everything. Instead of changing it, Black Lives Matter is trying to convince people to embrace it and make it a black thing, right? They want to embrace being late and, this is our black culture. This is what we do. This is what black people do. We're just late. We're late. Oh, you and you white supremacists with your rigid time schedules. No. You're not going to impose that on us. We're black. We're late. And if you say that black people should change or be on time, then you're being a racist. Kendi, in How to Be an Anti-Racist, he says that racial integration, right, people coming together, is a one-way street against black people. He calls it cultural lynching. I'm not kidding. And he considers integration to be more harmful than segregation, right? So integration is coming together, segregation is keeping it separate, right? Integration, he says, is more harmful because integrationists try to impose white values on black people by disguising them as universal values. Okay, so if I say, as opposed to if we were segregationists, then black people could show up late and white people could be on time and we can all do our own separate things. Okay? So if I say being punctual is a universal value, or at least an American value, because it's not in other countries, and that's fine, I guess, right? But in America, being punctual is a value. If I said that, Kendi would argue that I'm imposing a white supremacist value on black people, and I'm committing a cultural lynching. And I'm also robbing black people of their culture of being late. I'm taking that away from them, so I'm robbing it from them, and I'm imposing a new culture on them. That's the cultural lynching. And he'll say it's a black person value to be late. Now, this is where Kendi and others share an opinion with white supremacists. Kendi, this is super important. Black Lives Matter and white supremacists, they both believe that race and culture are the same thing. They believe race and culture are the same thing. So if you're black, your culture is to show up late. They're the same, they're one and the same. Now, if you're a white supremacist, you also think that all black people act a certain way. You also think that all black people are late and can't help it, therefore are inferior because of it. It's the same root belief, the idea that race and culture are the same. And there's many other things that the woke and racists have in common, and I forward you to this video that came out a couple weeks ago.
When me and Brad first met, I didn't think we'd get along, but turns out we kind of agree on everything. Your racial identity is the most important thing. Everything should be looked at through the lens of race.
Jinx, you owe me a Coke. We both have a lot of opinions about people of color, even though we barely know any.
I say colored people, but as long as we're classifying them, we both think minorities are a united group who think the same and act the same.
And vote the same. You don't want to lose your black card. Sorry, I don't know. I just think we should
Roll back discrimination laws so we can hire based on race again. Jinx, now you owe me a Coke.
Like a 3-minute video, like that's perfect. Absolute perfection, okay? I disagree. Black Lives Matter and white supremacists think that race and culture are the same. They're structuralists. I disagree. I think race is meaningless. It is absolutely meaningless. It is a social construct that is biblically and biologically meaningless. Culture is all that matters. Culture and habits, character. And the anti-racists today, they take the worst of black culture and celebrate it and divide us along those lines, white culture, black culture, and then call you a racist for saying, I don't think this is super healthy. Oh, you're a racist, you're committing a cultural lynching. True story, Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, you ready for this story? This is a humdinger. Greg Patton teaches business students, MBA students at USC, University of Southern California. He's a professor of clinical business communications. He's taught this course for years. And he was given an online lecture on the importance of pauses when you're giving a speech or a presentation. He said it's good to pause and let your audience absorb what you just said. Let people's brains catch up and think for a minute, right? So we talk about pauses and how they're good. And just when you're giving a speech, you just say something, pause, and then go on, as opposed to filling it, right? And he talked about how in English, we fill it with ums and uhs and ahs and all that stuff. He said, don't do that. Just speak, pause, continue on. And he said in his course, he likes to bring in different cultural examples. And he used the example that in China, he taught there for a long time, taught in Shanghai. He's been traveling there for 20 years. He said in China, they use the filler that. They say that. So they'll be like, oh, you know, it's really important that we go and do this together, whatever, right? So instead of uhs or ahs, they say the word that over and over quickly. Interesting, right? I didn't know that. Now, the problem is the word for that in Chinese is the word, it would be spelled phonetically, N-A-Y-G-A. N-A-Y-G-A. So you can go ahead and say that out loud. He got fired Now, I remember reading headlines a while back when this happened, and the headlines were, "Professor uses N-word in class." And everyone was so outraged. How could this professor in today's day and age use the N-word in class? Oh, he deserves to be fired. And then the video came out. Here is how it went down.
Of discomfort with pauses. And yet pauses, Steve Jobs, pausing can be incredibly powerful. Taking a break between ideas can help bring the audience in. If you have a lot of or ers, and this is culturally specific, so based on your native language, like in China, the common word is that. So in China, it might be nega. So there's different words that you'll hear in different countries, but they're vocal disfluencies. It's saying that,
Fired. I got him fired. It was just that. I promise you, there's nothing else. That's it. Now, here's the exact backstory of what happened. Like, no bad intention at all there, clearly. He didn't even say the word. Like that. So here's the backstory of what happened. This is super important to know. So first, we can see through these fake outrages. The fact that it's a super small minority of people, like a tiny, tiny handful of people who we give way too much attention to. And I would never give these people any attention if this very small group of people did not have life-changing ramifications for people's livelihoods, right? If this was a handful of people who complained about this professor and then were told to pipe down by the administration, then it would be nothing. It wouldn't even be a story, and of course we wouldn't be wasting our time with it. But this guy got fired. And there's a lesson for all of us because the mob is gonna come for you too. So here's what happened. He used that example in class. He's been using it for years, and he used it 3 times in one day. He did 3 of the same lecture in one day for different groups of the class, right? No one said anything. 200 students, no one said anything. He had virtual office hours after the lecture, no one said anything. Weeks later, no one said anything for weeks, right? And he had course evaluations. Out of 200 course evaluations, 2 people mentioned that example. One mentioned it in passing, and another said their feelings were hurt. So the next morning, he gave an apology. He wrote out an apology email to the class. He said, "My intent has always been to integrate and bring more and varied voices from different perspectives, and I failed with an example Thursday." So he brought more attention to it. Then he brought it up the next Zoom lecture, right? He apologized again to the class the next lecture. That same morning, I was gonna say a group of students, but we don't even know if it was a group of students because they didn't sign it. So it could have been just that one student, right? Could have been someone who wasn't even in the class, sent an email to the head of the business school. And they said that this professor showed negligence and disregard, and it was grave and inappropriate. And they mentioned George Floyd in the example. Our mental health has been affected. It's an uneasy feeling, allowing him to have power over our grades. We would rather not take this course and to endure the emotional exhaustion. Remember, that's one of their techniques, is to say, "I'm so tired, I'm exhausted." Emotional exhaustion of carrying on with an instructor that disregards cultural diversity and sensitivities, and by extension creates an unwelcome environment for us Black students. The way we heard it in class was indicative of a much more hurtful word with tremendous implications for the Black community. We should not be made to feel ignored and belittled in an institution that prides itself on being a family. We are burdened to fight for our existence in society, in the workplace, and in America. We shouldn't have to fight for our existence at USC. Isn't that amazing? Like, these kids, they're business students at USC, and so oppressed. So oppressed. And it was signed Black MBA candidates class of 2022. So they never made themselves known. Again, it could be just one person. And I said it could be someone who wasn't even in the class. So the administration offered 3 options, or a couple options. They said, you can do independent study for the rest of the course. You can have your grades, your papers or whatever graded by another professor, because that was one of their complaints, right? That this guy's in charge of our grades. So you can have your paper or whatever graded by another professor. You can take an elective, or you can take the same course from another professor, right? So all these different options. And this group or people, person, whatever, rejected all of them. And they demanded that he be fired. And they did. This is the dean. It was simply unacceptable. This is the part that blows my mind more than anything. You stupid kids, whatever. But the fact that other fellow adults, coworkers of this professor, weren't like, shut up, kids. Like, pipe down. But instead, this is simply unacceptable for faculty to use words in class that can marginalize, hurt, and harm the psychological safety of our students. He didn't use the word. And I love that, the psychological safety. What the heck does that mean? He was deeply saddened by this disturbing episode that's caused so much anguish and trauma, but what happened cannot be undone. Isn't that insane? So, what stands out to you about that story? A couple things to me. First, this guy's been teaching for decades, right? Of course, he's the exact same example. No one's ever been offended by it. And today, one person does. And clearly they weren't at first. Right? Weeks later, made a big deal about it and demanded he get fired. And the administration caves, throws him under the bus. So that's like the first thing, is you'll probably get thrown under the bus by your boss eventually. There's a good chance you'll get thrown under the bus. There's also a lesson here on not apologizing. So let me say this first. If you're in a position of authority, like if you're the manager, don't throw your employees under the bus, right? Don't cave to the mob and make that a conviction now, because it's going to happen soon. You're going to be forced to be in that opportunity. So decide not to right now. If you're an individual person, never even attempt to appease the mob. And don't apologize for something you're not sorry for. If you're sorry for something, then by all means, like yesterday on the show, I got something wrong, and we did a whole segment on me making amends for it, right? And it was wrong. I did not understand something, and I corrected it, right? So yeah, apologize for that. But don't apologize for something you're not sorry for, right? It's a cult. A cult that does not believe in repentance or forgiveness. Do not give them an inch. They will not stop until they destroy you. Even for something you didn't even do. For a word you didn't even say. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, let's circle back around. So the very first segment of the show, we talked with someone from the Heritage Foundation all about the Abraham Accords that were signed yesterday between UAE, Bahrain, and I like how I say Bahrain very, very officially, and Israel, of course, and the importance of that on a pretty detailed level. Right now, I want to go to Ryan Helfenbein. He's the executive director of the Falkirk Center at Liberty University, and sort of talk some big picture stuff here. Ryan, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm glad you're here. So let's start, I think, from the very beginning. Why is Israel important? Why do we care? Why should Americans care about Israel?
Well, since the late 40s, in terms of a nation state, the modern nation state of Israel is one of the biggest pro-freedom, pro-democracy supporters in the region. And so when you think about what that means geopolitically, militarily, for trade, and for everything else, they are in a nestled in a very strategic position there when you think about the Arabian Peninsula, Africa, and then into the greater Eurasian continent. So Israel has a unique advantage, and for the United States, that serves our strategy purposes long term as we try to obviously reach into those regions. It's not a situation where you look at Israel and say, Israel is sorry, I just got tongue-tied. Excuse me. Israel is overreaching, or Israel is inhumane in their treatment of people. It's just the opposite of what liberals and leftists might say, especially in this country. So they're very important. But religiously, and in the United States of America, and the title of the accord is the Abrahamic Accord, for a reason, and that is because both in the Jewish faith and in the Christian faith, Israel has significance. For most Christians, We are Zionists for a reason. We differentiate what the biblical definition of what a Zionist is from the modern nation state. Most Christians look at Israel in terms of God's promises, land promises that were given to Abraham, and that echoes the same in the Jewish faith. The fulfillment of all of that is not in the modern nation state of Israel. The fulfillment of all of that in Revelation chapter 21 is a new heavens and a new earth that descends down from heaven. And so Jesus Christ himself, the King of all kings, the Lord of all lords, will be reigning in the new heavens and new earth. And what is that called? Israel. Is that the same as the modern nation state? No. But we as Americans and as citizens of the United States support Israel because we're trying to achieve the same goals throughout the world, and that is largely peaceful, and through trade and through human flourishing. That's what we're wanting to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting distinction. Yeah, speak to that more, because I've never heard that. I want to make sure I get that right. So, because that's what I've heard is that is like God's promised land, right? And we need to protect it and make sure it's held by the good guys. But you're saying it's yes and. It's that and more. So what's the more than that?
The more than that is this. The Bible makes a clear distinction, and this. I'm speaking, and I've got to put on theology hat for just a moment.
Yes, please.
But the Bible speaks in clear terms that the messianic fulfillment is not through the patriarch of Abraham, but ultimately Israel comes down to a person. So while the Abrahamic promise was given in Genesis that his descendants would outnumber the sands of the sea or the stars in the sky, God gives a specific promise. This is Christians are looking to this text as a kind of prolegomena, as a gospel. But through his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Jesus Christ comes as the fulfillment of that. The gospel that Jesus died for the sins of the world, so that through faith in him, upon believing in him, they might be saved. So the ultimate fulfillment in Israel is not a nation state, but it's actually a people that God has made for himself, children of God. And that fulfillment is really through Christ. It's through a person, not just a nation state. So in so much as Christians living in America are Zionists looking for that hopeful fulfillment through Jesus, and that would be people like Billy Graham and many other great Christian leaders. We partner with Israelis, we partner with Jewish leaders, Orthodox Jews, and the whole gambit. We're doing that because we see in context of Scripture that there is a promise that, yes, it is a geographical promise, and it's tied to a land, but it's tied to a person as well, and that's the person of Jesus. So Israel has no stronger supporter than actual Christians who uphold and affirm the Word of God as inerrant and infallible biblical truth.
Beautiful. Why? And so take off your theology hat and put on a comparative religion hat.
Sure.
Why would the Muslims in UAE and Bahrain sign on to something called the Abraham Accords? So obviously, we talk about the normalizing of relations and trade and like all that geopolitically. We get that. We talked about that earlier. But is Abraham an important player in the Muslim faith, is my question.
Oh, certainly. Now, within the Muslim faith, and of course, Islam arrives on the scene around 600 AD, they believe Abraham to be one of the Muslim prophets. And so if you remember, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael was the firstborn, and Isaac came after. And similar to the situation with Isaac had two sons. And it was Jacob and Esau. Jacob, whose name was later changed to Israel. He who struggles or wrestles with God. In both of those pictures, there was a warring and fighting between the brothers. If you look at the descendants of Ishmael, that is largely the Canaanite and the modern nation states that surround both Bedouin tribes and then those who have settled down and created cities and governments and all of that, right? Modern nation states. So do they share a commonality? Of course they do, because of the faith of Abraham. But I'm going to make a theological distinction and to say both Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are not the same religion. They uphold different ideas and different theological categories. While there's even similarities between Judaism and Christianity, the difference is we believe in the divinity of Christ, and he is the ultimate fulfillment of every Abrahamic promise.
No, they're not the same religion, and I'll make the statement that is not appropriate today, is that we don't worship the same God either. We hear
Correct.
that a lot, right?
That's right.
And that's not true. Now, we only got about a minute, but do the leaders of these Muslim countries know this history? So, and I say it because most Americans don't, right? Everything you just said, most Americans don't know that. Most Americans don't know their Bible and don't know this true history, this history. Do you think these Muslim leaders do and profoundly understand the historical implications of what's happening now? Or do you think they're more like perhaps a Trump, which is just like, let's do the right thing for the moment, pragmatically?
I think they're operating pragmatically. You got to remember too that within Islam, and I'm going back and forth. You're asking great questions, Mike, that I don't normally get, and so I get to even at the Falkirk Center, we talk about these different ideas and issues. But when you think about modern Islam, there is also this idea of a caliphate. So, if you're following that to the ultimate theological implications, it's something far, far different. In terms of a nation state brokering a peace deal, it is great for everyone. It leads to greater trade, greater outcomes for people, greater human flourishing, greater freedom, greater security. All of those things are huge. And I think those goals we all want to achieve. Long term, these faiths and ideologies will produce very different outcomes. And I do believe that peace is only a brokered peace for a season and for a time. And that's why there's been so much difficulty that long outlasts any presidency or a 50 or 100-year period. You've seen warring in that region for thousands of years because it goes all the way back again to Abraham.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Ryan Helfenbein from the Falkirk Center, Executive Director of. Hey, Ryan, thanks, man. Appreciate your insight.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
Really good. Thanks, brother. And that's it. That's the end of the show. True story. Mike Slater. We'll do it again tomorrow. Spread the word.